Hare Krishna, everyone. Welcome once again to the Engaged Bhakti podcast. I am your host, Krishna Kishore Das, and I'm very grateful and honored to be here today with a dear friend and a friend of mine who I once lived with for some time in the New Vrindavan community, Sankirtan Dasa, also known as Andy Frankel. Sankirtan, welcome. Thank you so much for being part of the podcast.
My pleasure. Hare Krishna. I really appreciate the work that you're doing on all fronts.
Yeah, and the feeling is very mutual. I lived in New Vrindavan. It was back, I think, almost over 10 years ago, 2006 to 2008, when I was a young brahmachari. And
I'm still here.
Yeah, you're a longtime member of the community. We'll talk a little bit about that today too. And I just wanted to give folks an introduction for you, since maybe some folks don't know you who are in our audience today. Sankirtan Andy Frankel is an award-winning author, sacred storyteller. 2 books that he has published. This one, Mahabharata, The Eternal Quest, which is your very cinematic retelling of the Mahabharata. And you also have recently published Hanuman's Quest of the Ramayana. You're a recipient of a West Virginia Artist Fellow.
Hanuman's Quest.
Hanuman's Quest, okay. Yeah, there it is. There you go.
Both of the covers were illustrated by my daughter.
There you go. You're a recipient of West Virginia Artist Fellowship Award, Indie Book Award, Storytelling World Award, Ohio River Border Initiative Grant. You've given a lot of really wonderful workshops and performances at different events like the Parliament of World Religions, the Revisiting Indus-Saraswati Civilization in Ancient India Conference. You've even done Unity Day at the FBI Center. Numerous colleges and books. You've done programs into the stories and teachings of ancient India. This is your expertise. This is what you've been immersed in for many decades now. The Mahabharata, the Ramayana, the Srimad Bhagavatam. And of course, you're a disciple of Srila Prabhupada, a longtime resident of New Vrindavan community in West Virginia. And I vividly joyfully remember your tours, your stories that you would give to guests at New Vrindavan coming in all the time. And you're one of the reasons I especially wanted to reconnect with you and have this conversation is you're one of the most creative devotees I know. And I think our tradition is so conducive for creativity in so many different artistic ways. And that creativity is such an important element of Engaged Bhakti. And for more information on Sankirtan's work, you can check out mahabharat-project.com. You can email him at story108@juno.com as well. And I love the story that you tell about when you were actually doing this 2-man play of the Mahabharata in New York City. And I wonder if you wanted to share a little bit about that experience and also maybe what had brought you in the first place to practice devotional service through elements like theater, storytelling. I know you have some filmmaking experience as well.
Let me just answer the second one first. I was living in the East Village. I'm an old New Yorker. Lived in the East Village as a young man in 1967, 68, 69, not very far from 26 Second Avenue. Mm-hmm. And I was going to college. I met my wife in college, and for my film course, I was asked to do a documentary, just a very short documentary. And I thought, well, these Hare Krishnas, I saw them before. They're pretty photogenic. Let me do a short documentary on them. And then my wife joined me. She was majoring in sociology, and she said she was going to do a paper for her sociology class on the Hare Krishnas.
Very sociologically interesting.
So that's my initial contact. After we graduated, we left New York City and went up to Nova Scotia for almost a year. Wow. And lived up there. We took the Bhagavad Gita with us. In the old days, let me get it. The early Bhagavad Gita that was first printed was an abridged version by Prabhupada with an introduction by Allen Ginsberg and also Denise Levital and Thomas Merton.
So, yeah, that was, for me, when I got into Thomas Merton was that introduction to the Gita.
So we were, reading the Bhagavad Gita up in Nova Scotia, and we, at that time, we got japa beads. We went to a hobby shop and made our own, and started chanting. We were already vegetarians, and that was the beginning of our Krishna consciousness journey. And so, and even at that time, when I was going to college in New York City at City College, actually, in the library I found a book, stories from. It was written and published in around 1916, and it had a collection of books. A collection of stories from the Vedic literatures. And there was one beautiful story that I was very much attracted to about Yudhisthira and the dog, and how he, befriends the dog on his journey into the Himalayan mountains. And he is joined, of course, by his brothers and Draupadi, and they all fall away. And Yudhisthira is alone with the dog. And he's offered entrance into heaven, but the dog is not allowed. And Yudhisthira steps back, and he's not going without the dog. The dog is his friend. And so I took this story and made it into a little one-act play for my theater course. And so those were my early beginnings, and later on, of course, Lokamangala and we worked together doing theater performances for the movement for over 10 years. I joined the devotees in New York City in 1979. Lokamangala, of course, is famous in his portrayal of Ravana. Everybody knows Loka. And he and I had a very good working relationship, and we performed throughout the 1980s. And I heard that Peter Brook had been developing a 9-hour drama of Mahabharata, a live performance with an international cast, and he was going on tour. And part of that tour, he would be in New York in the fall of 1987 at the Brooklyn Academy of Music, also known as BAM. And I heard about this at the very beginning of 1987 in New Brindavan. And I thought, why don't we get together a Mahabharata and perform it simultaneously? When Peter Brook goes to New York, we'll go to New York, and there'll be a little bit of a rivalry, and it'll stir up some interest. And so the unfortunate thing is that we couldn't find any other devotees to be part of the cast. So Lokamangala and I wound up doing a two-man Mahabharata. We rewrote the script, and of course he played 6 characters. He played Krishna and the blind king, Dhritarashtra, and Yudhisthira, and several others. And I played Duryodhana and Vidura and Arjun. And we were also storytellers. We had 12 scenes. They were very flushed out. And in between the scenes, we helped the audience along by explaining a little bit more of the story and the connective tissue behind the different scenes. And so we performed that in New York in 1987 in the fall. We rented a theater off Broadway on 54th Street and 9th Avenue. It was called the American Theater of Actors. And we had a pretty good run. We were even reviewed by the New York Times, and they said that they referred to us as the other Mahabharata.
really this makes me think about that, even going back to what Vyasadeva was doing in compiling the Puranas and the Itihasas and all of these histories, is this the sense that in this day and age, many of us are not so philosophically inclined. We're not necessarily going to dive head first into the Upanishads, and it was much more about how to that sense of compassion that Vyasadeva had, Srila Vyasadeva, towards how do we help people in the Kali Yuga really connect to the deepest aspects of Krishna, the reality of the divine, the reality of the supreme. And this is through stories. This is through the art of telling a story, of a narrative, and how important that element is to our culture, and thinking about also the plays that Rupa Goswami wrote as well. I'd be interested to hear, in your long kind of history of telling stories, what has been some of your deeper realizations about how this really communicates Krishna consciousness to people? What is it about a good story that makes people really experience bhakti in a deep way?
Well, the thing is that the human being, is habitually a storyteller and a story listener.
Yeah.
We're fascinated by stories through the books and cinema, live performances. And so one of the experience that I had in New York City, there's one night, there was a young man that came from the NYU theater department. And, he was really surprised that here the Hare Krishnas were doing the Mahabharata. He was very familiar with Peter Brook's Mahabharata. And so he told us, because after our performance, Lokamangala and I, in costume, we would go out to the lobby and we would thank everyone, all of the audience members, for coming to see the play. And so we met a lot of different people and got a lot of different insights. And this fella, he wanted to interview us. So a couple of days later, we met, and he said, whenever I see the Hare Krishnas on the street, this is in 1987, he said, I would always cross the street and avoid them like anything. But here you're making me pay $10 to see you and to hear this wonderful story. He said, you're building bridges. And so for me, that was very important. How do we actually build bridges? Prabhupada said we have to rack our brains to make this Krishna consciousness available to people all over the world. And so that's different. We all have our own unique way of making that available. So that was one of the first things, is I wanted to be a bridge builder and take the philosophy and take the stories and somehow make them available to the general public. So for me, it was first I was the theater. And then later on, I had some health issues. I had a heart attack in 1994, and I transitioned from theater into storytelling. Because there's a great interest in storytelling in the United States, and now it's actually spread all over the world. And so, the storytelling community had been developing in the late 70s and into the 80s. And then I was really surprised to hear that people actually make a living by traveling around to colleges and schools and libraries telling stories. So it was too much of a strain to continue with theater. So I transitioned into dramatic storytelling and going to schools and libraries. And in this way, I made a livelihood for myself. But over the years, starting about 10 or 12 years ago, then I kind of began to slow down in doing, storytelling and doing workshops. I did a workshop. One workshop was on helping people how to share stories. And the other one was actually a workshop. This was much more generic on, it's called In Search of Story. which helps people explore their own stories in their life's journey. And so later on, I saw the need for, putting these stories into a form that would people could share. So I put the Mahabharata into I wrote it in such a way, because of my cinema background, I wanted to share the Mahabharata in a kind of a very cinematic way.
Yeah.
What would it look like for me if the Mahabharata was a movie? And so that's the way I try to write my Mahabharata, and I have a couple of other books out as well.
For those folks who are listening who might not be familiar with the Mahabharata or the Ramayana, sometimes if I meet someone who's not familiar with these narratives, there's a way you can kind of compare it to things like Lord of the Rings, for example. I mean, some people I've even heard it compare it to the show Game of Thrones, which is is an interesting comparison, but certainly not one-to-one. But for those, and then some folks might be listening who are really interested in kind of yoga and spirituality and storytelling, what is it about the Mahabharata and the Ramayana in particular which is so compelling? These are, they're immense texts, but they have some very deep central meanings to that. And for those who might be interested to dive into the Mahabharata and Ramayana, why should they take the time to do so?
The thing is that Plato, about 600 years after the Iliad and Odyssey were written by Homer, he said, these books are extraordinary. They're beautiful poems, poetry, and also very exciting stories. But Plato regretted that there was no philosophy in these books about the Greek culture and the Greek philosophy. And so I think he would like the Mahabharata, because the Mahabharata is beautiful poetry, a fantastic history and the stories, and also includes a lot of philosophy as well. It's all integrated. And the beauty of the Mahabharata is that the philosophy is integrated into the stories. And so I think Plato would have been delighted to see these books, Mahabharata and Ramayana.
Do you have a favorite story from the Mahabharata which you think really is both like a really good example of great storytelling, but also which presents the philosophy very effectively?
Well, one of the reasons I wrote the Mahabharata also is because I saw that really there was a lack of understanding in the broader culture of what a real leader is, what they're supposed to do, what are they? And so, there's a whole disconnect in our culture. Nobody really knows what a leader is. And the Mahabharata, through the different stories, gives perfect examples of the responsibility of leadership. And so there's a number of different stories. One is on King Shibi, who was petitioned by a bird, a dove, that the dove was being pursued by a hawk. And the dove petitioned King Shibi, please save me, I'm about to be killed. And then the hawk shows up, and the hawk says, well, if you want to save this bird, what about me? I'm also a citizen in your kingdom. And what do I do? This is a natural food for me. What are you going to do? And so Shibi says, I have a warehouse full of food. You can have whatever you want. But the dove rejects that, because he said, this is human food. It's not my food. He said, what I'll allow is if you give the weight of flesh compared to the dove. And so Shibi arranges a scale. He puts the dove on one side, and he starts cutting off flesh and throwing it on the other scale. But the scale is always in favor of the dove. The dove is a little happier, a little weighs a little bit more. And anyways, so she keeps cutting off another piece of flesh, but somehow the weight of the dove is still, it's kind of a mystical experience. How come the dove's weight is still just a touch heavier than, and so finally the king puts himself on the scale. And here he's prepared to make a sacrifice. And so leadership basically is all about sacrificing for the citizens, not taking advantage of the citizens,
right,
but sacrificing for the citizens. And one of my favorite passages in the Mahabharata, because Yudhisthira and his brothers, they develop a beautiful city, a beautiful kingdom in Hastinapura. It's like the new city. You know, and at one point there was New York, which was the new city.
right.
But here, in 5,000 years ago, Hastinapura was the new city with so much potential and so much, you know, there's so many things happening politically and artistically and economically. And so Narada Muni shows up, and Narada Muni is an extraordinary sage. He's conversant in spiritual matters, and he's also conversant in material matters.
Mm-hmm.
So he shares with Yudhisthira what it means to what it means to be a leader, and what he shares actually echoes the Declaration of Independence, which says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so Narada Muni also gives three things that the king has to make sure that the citizens are happy in all respects. So the happiness is one thing. And then how is that happiness delivered? The other thing is justice. That the happiness is delivered through justice and also through economic development. So that echoes, there's life. Life is kind of the economic development. You need to maintain yourself. And then there's the life, liberty, justice reflects liberty. We need justice. We can't have liberty without justice. And then there's the happiness that, so what happens is that Narada Muni tells Yudhisthira that don't allow justice to, don't manipulate justice to gain wealth or happiness. And don't use your wealth to manipulate justice. This is very important, because basically in corrupt leadership, this is going on all the time, this type of manipulation. So Narada Muni identifies these problems and issues in the Mahabharata 5,000 years ago. So these stories are very relevant for us today.
That, you know, the sense that these personalities like Vyasadeva and Narada Muni, they had the foresight, the prophetic foresight, as it were, to see what was going to come in the Kali Yuga and to present a kind of eternally relevant example of what it means to actually be a leader. And this is where I think, you know, I think the wonderful service you're doing, and I think what really kind of the intrinsic nature of these stories, like in the Mahabharata, present that example, because we just have no shortage of people in leadership roles these days, whether in political levels or in institutions where, and that's so interesting, the kind of the mix, the kind of keep justice and wealth from mixing and influencing each other, because it's just something we see. And unfortunately, in the culture we live in, where, you know, wealth definitely influences justice to the point where it's very hard for many people to believe that there's such a thing as justice. So that's what I think is just magnificent about the Mahabharata, is that even though it may seem culturally different in some ways from the culture that we may live in, it speaks so much to kind of human nature. It's a great story about human nature.
Yes, in the Srimad Bhagavatam, it's explained in the Kali Yuga, there's going to be a point, maybe we've reached that point, I don't know, that you can't get justice without wealth.
Right.
You know, the wealthy have a different level of justice than the common people.
Yeah.
What kind of irks me is that, you know, they show on the news that, you know, the regular people in the streets, there's a difference between the demonstrators and the rioters. Mm-hmm. But the politicians, they want to make that a muddled. And so you have the rioters and they're throwing rocks through store windows and they're running into these stores in the middle of the night and carrying out this stuff. Mm-hmm. And so the government and people in general, they say, oh, look at that. These people have to be punished. And so the government likes this because, and the leaders, the wealthy love this type of stuff because while they're pointing to the common person just breaking into a store and stealing a few items, in the meantime, behind our backs, right, they're cutting off huge amounts of wealth. Yeah. The political leaders and the bankers, the multinational corporations, and so the people are distracted by, oh, these rioters have to be punished, and in the meantime, they're being ripped off in a ghastly form of, you know, these rascals and rogues. Yeah. And they're being, unfortunately, the people are being duped.
Yeah, it's a very simple trick of illusion that has very complex effects on everything we do practically in our lives. And you know, it always strikes me too, reading about like Maharaj Yudhisthira, the great Vedic kings, just this sense of care. And this is something that always strikes me when I'm reading Mahabharata, reading the Bhagavatam, or reading Prabhupada's explanations of these verses, that it was the absolute first responsibility of a king, of a ruler, of a leader, to care not just for every human being, but also to care for every living being as well. And it makes me, you know, I constantly come back to this, the first verse in the Ishopanishad, which talks about how Krishna gives us everything we need in this world, gives us our quota, as Prabhupada translated it. And it's not just for like basic survival needs, but it's really for quality of life. It's for like deep well-being. It's for, we use this word a lot in kind of, us ecological scholars use this word flourishing quite a bit. Like, what does it mean to flourish? And that was the king's responsibility. Like, they were failing if any but one living being in their kingdom was not flourishing. And that to me is always one of the most powerful messages about what it means to be a leader, to be a servant leader. I think that's one way Martin Luther King, for example, described it. And I think that's one of the most powerful lessons from the Mahabharata.
Not only in the Mahabharata, also in the 4th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, it explains that one of the important qualities of a king or a leader is mercy and compassion. Mm-hmm. So that has to be exhibited by the leadership, that mercy and compassion. And there's also a quality of responsibility. There's a very grave responsibility for a leader. Just one story in the Mahabharata is that Arjuna is walking in the marketplace and someone comes to him and says, my cows have been stolen last night. And so Arjuna immediately gets his bow and arrow and to go after the culprits. And it's explained in that section of the Mahabharata that the leader has such a responsibility that if they don't retrieve the stolen goods, mm-hmm. then the leader has to replace those stolen goods. That's the quality, that's the responsibility of leadership. But in our culture, people in the form of the stock market or various other ways, they're being ripped off left and right. but no one is offering, and some people, unfortunately, in their old age, they have their retirements that are being stolen, but no leader is offering to replace
Right.
those goods.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we see this now with the pandemic and just how difficult it is for the American government just to provide basic care for people. I mean, it's just, this is where I think, you know, we have the wisdom of our tradition is so much to offer, and of course we have to embody that in our own lives and in our own relationships as well. And you know, it's I think what also strikes me quite a bit in reading these narratives of leadership and these texts in the Mahabharata and the Bhagavatam is that it's so much about fostering a spirit of cooperation between everybody rather than a spirit of competition, because that is really such a powerful element of the age that we live in, is how much we compete with each other. And we really see that really the more sacred energy is how do we cooperate with each other. And that is what I think no end of examples that we get from these leaders.
One of the things that Prabhupada points out is that you need the culture, the society needs to be self-sustaining. And so that means that right now, you know, our society, the way the general society is run, we're not self-sustaining. And we're actually robbing from future generations to maintain our standard of happiness and our standard of sense gratification. We're actually taking from, you know, we're racking up in the way of like just what is it called? You know, a debt is monumental. And so one thing the Native American people say is that whatever you do, consider how the next 7 generations are going to be impacted by whatever you do. And, you know, this society and the economy is like run away. They're not considering the next generation or the next 7 generations. They only want to maintain their standard of sense gratification. And so how do you address these things? People are so addicted, it's almost impossible.
Yeah, that's a good word to describe it. I wanted to especially ask you, I mean, you have been immersed in these stories for many decades now, especially in the Bhagavad Gita. And really the tension, the story of the Gita really encapsulates what I think what we're trying to discover engaged bhakti is and can be, because there's this tension that Arjuna doesn't want to fight. He has pretty good reasons for not wanting to fight, but yet that is what Krishna tells him to do. And it's the sense that this very clear teaching that we have to act in this world. So that's pretty much established quite up front, but then the question is how to act. And I wanted to read just a little section here just so folks can hear your beautiful writing from Mahabharata, The Eternal Quest.
Thank you.
You encapsulate the Gita so succinctly here, and I'll follow up with the question. And Arjuna, he's at that point, he says, it's confusing. On one hand, you encourage me to fight, and on the other, you tell me to be free from all gain and loss. So what is the best course of action? That's such, I think, like a nice sutra of what engaged bhakti we're trying to discover. So Krishna says it's true. Those who become entangled in the pursuit of worldly opulence and pleasures are bewildered as to the real goal of life. In this state of being, they are frustrated life after life and continually chase after the fleeting pleasures of this world. They give up the search for the true self. On the one hand, work binds you, but on the other hand, you should not abstain from work. That will not bring you to enlightenment. No one can stop from being active. Everyone must work according to their nature. Thus, it's best when you perform your work as a sacrifice, an offering to the one Supreme Lord. Seeing your actions, even the gods in the heavens will be pleased with you and give you their blessings. Ultimately, freedom from lust, greed, and anger, and from all worldly entanglements is found through acts of self-sacrifice. Therefore, whatever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you give in charity, or whatever acts of kindness you perform, do it as a sacrifice for me. And this, obviously, I mean, people that I know, that we know, that many devotees know, or devotees themselves are involved in justice movements, who are really becoming more and more aware of the incredible social issues that we face in the world today. So that's, and there's a lot of questions, like we act, and there's, especially when we're working in justice work, we want to end, we want to end racism, we want to end discrimination, we want to end these systems that are really oppressing so many people. But there's a danger there, there's a tension that in doing that work, we can become too attached to the result, which can be self-defeating in the first place. So it's a question, we must work to our own nature, but I wanted to ask you, especially if you've been so immersed in this work, what is it that we need to kind of put aside or sacrifice? And this is for devotees who are interested in this question, and other folks who might be listening to this, who are interested in justice work, participating in this. What is that? What are some of those essential things we need to put aside so that we can actually act properly in this world, act for the best well-being of everybody?
Well, we have to put aside the, Krishna explains to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita that we have a right to perform our duty. This is called swadharma. Dharma has many different nuances. It could mean your religion, it could mean your occupation, it could mean your responsibility to society, it could mean justice. And so it also could mean who we are, and what is our contribution, what is our mission here in this world. And so it's interesting, you bring up the idea that Arjuna, he's inquiring from Krishna, but Arjuna himself is a worldly man. Yeah. He's not a saint, he's not a sadhu, he's not some renunciate, and he's a leader, he's a prince, and engaged in worldly activities. So Krishna is speaking to Arjuna in one sense, in that capacity. Don't give up work, but whatever you do it for my pleasure. And also don't be attached to the result of the work, because we may work very diligently, but the fruits may come or they may not come. We can't be attached. So we're only, in one sense, our attachment is to our nature. Krishna explains that we can't kind of hold down our nature, but we're working according to our nature. And so this is interesting, because Krishna ultimately says that it's better to work according to your own nature, rather than accepting some other type of work that, or assuming some other nature. You might even be successful. That might even prove to make you very wealthy. But if you renounce your own nature and the type of work that comes with it, you'll never be happy. So this is a very important distinction that Krishna makes. Don't give up, because people are striving to be happy. How to be happy. And so here Krishna focuses right in. Pursue the work that is appropriate to your own nature. Who are we? And so when I joined the Hare Krishna movement in the 70s, I was very much into theater. I was with a regional theater company in Madison, Wisconsin for several years. And I was even thinking of going back to college and getting a master's degree in theater and teaching theater. But then when my wife and I, when we decided to be more involved in the Krishna tradition, we gave up our desires. And then coming to New Vrindavan in 1976, after being here for a couple of years, I realized that for people to, in one sense, to go the long haul in Krishna consciousness, they have to get back to their own nature.
Yeah.
And so, in one sense, I've renounced my interest in theater. That was my natural inclination. But then I came to the realization that and even when I was here in Nuvendab, when I came here, well, I was thinking, what can I get into?
Yeah.
Could I get into, maybe I'll get into stained glass work or pottery work, you know, something artsy and craftsy. But then I realized, well, wait a minute, I already have something.
Mm-hmm.
And so I renewed my interest in theater. So that was in 78 and 79. And at the end of 79, I went to New York to join with the Vaikuntha players for 6 months. And that's where I met Lokamangala, and we developed a very close bond and friendship.
Mm-hmm.
And because of our mutual interest in really doing theater in the right way. Not just throwing together some sort of a play or skit in a matter of hours or days,
Yeah.
but really focusing on the characters and the intention of the personalities involved in the story.
Mm.
And it may take weeks or months
Yeah.
to really focus properly. And so we wanted to approach that theater work in a very serious way. And so we collaborated together for over 10 years. And so that's been, you know, very important for me to get back to the Swadharma.
Yeah.
Who are we? What is our contribution? What is our particular contribution to our society?
Yeah. I can't appreciate that point enough. I mean, that's also from my own experience. You know, eventually coming back and going back into school and doing the whole graduate school thing, becoming a PhD, and all the while it was kind of a rediscovery of my Swadharma. And I think those of us, you know, as you're saying, who we have these innate talents and capacities and abilities, and when we embrace them in devotional service, it's just such a natural, kind of a natural groove to your life. You'll feel really like very deeply rooted, not only in the process, in the practice, but also you're deeply rooted in yourself. And I think that's a constant theme of what we're talking about in this podcast, is that engagement starts really with almost an embrace of your humanity too, as a devotee. We sometimes try to, I know from my own experience, try to be supermen or super women devotionally without, and that can have consequences, especially if we are trying to give up something that could be perfectly useful in our practice. And I think that's one of the keys. That's one of the keys that unlocks the question of how we engage with the world. We can't really, each one of us, in the unique way that we can engage, it has to begin with knowing ourselves. And that will unlock so much of the mystery of how we participate together in the world. So I want to thank you so much. It's such an important point. I think, you know, we're talking about a lot of, I think what's we're trying to do in these conversations is, you know, we're talk about some of the philosophical side, but also talk about some of the existential everyday life side of this practice too, because that is where really
right.
the realizations come from.
This is a lifelong journey, and actually sometimes without knowing it, that journey begins in very early years. And so I was born in Germany, and I came to America. My father actually was a Polish Jew, and my mother was a German Lutheran, and they met after World War II. And his friends were saying, "Oh, this will never work," and her friends were saying, "Oh, this relationship will never work." But they didn't listen to their friends, and they got married. My father, he had an opportunity to come to America, to New York City, and he worked for several years, and he raised enough money to bring my mother and myself. And so I grew up in a little village, maybe 50 houses. And then I was thrust into the middle of New York City at the age of 5. And immediately I went to the public schools, and it was just a shock. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know English yet, and I didn't know how to express myself. So for me, this was a lifelong journey into expression and communication. That started in the early part of my childhood. And I've been, experimenting with different things. When I was a kid, I wrote poetry. And then I even bought $100 worth of art supplies, thinking that I would, express myself through art. But the funny thing is that I never used those art supplies. I left them in my room at in my parents' apartment when I went off to college in New York City. I moved out of my parents' apartment, but my father found the art supplies, and in retirement, he started painting some really amazing paintings. And so this need to express ourselves and to communicate is there in each one of us. And the funny thing is that over the years, when I've done my workshop in search of story, a lot of people, they say, I'm not a creative person. I see so many creative persons around me, but I'm not a creative person myself. And I say, no, we're all creative. We all have that inclination within us. And so whether we want to, we don't have to be like an artist or a writer to be creative. We could create a garden. The farmers, they're creating gardens. They're creating crops. We can create a family. We can create some sort of a business enterprise. That creative element is there in all of us, and it starts with Brahma, the creator of the universe. He created the universe. He's a jiva soul like we are. And he created this material universe. Of course, there are many, many universes. And Brahma created the universe. And we all have that inclination to create. And unfortunately, the way we grow up and the demands of our educational system never allow us really to connect with our swadharma. And so many people, unfortunately, grow up, they're confused and they're bewildered as to how to proceed in life. And so the Bhagavad Gita is such valuable information. How to connect with these inner longings and these inner intentions and with our eternal spirituality.
Well, Prabhu, thank you so much for this conversation. And I would like to invite you back again soon, because I know you also wanted to talk a lot about the New Vrindavan project, and that could be another conversation we do. Again, it's a long, complex story, the New Vrindavan story, and I'd love to talk with you more about that, especially since you've lived there for such a long time. And I spent some of my formative years there as well. So we'll do that again soon.
Well, it's been a great conversation, and I really appreciate your support of my work. And I must thank you.
So again, Sankirtan's books, also under his name, Andy Frankel, Mahabharata, The Eternal Quest, Hanuman's Quest of the Ramayana, and you can check out more of his work at Mahabharata, which, let me spell that for people who might not know, Mahabharata-project.com. You can also email Sankirtan directly, story108@gmail.com. And these are amazing books. They really are very deep and very exciting.
Thank you.
And that is your great service that you've done. So thank you so much. And thank you for listening, folks. Subscribe to our podcast on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube, and like our Facebook page. And we will see you again soon. Hare Krishna.